Coming up on today's show, the Jacobite steam train returns but fails on its first run of the season. Is the East Coast Main Line timetable change heading towards a repeat of the 2018 Thameslink and Northern timetable fiascos? Is the only answer to this and the other challenges facing the industry a British Rail 2.0? Richard thinks it is, and I think I agree. The Railway Industry Association launches a plan to deliver a lower cost, higher performing net zero railway by 2050. And Northern use classical music to curb antisocial behaviour. Yes, really. Hello and welcome to Green Signals, your perceptive, hopefully railway podcast. From me, Nigel Harris, here in Lincolnshire, and
me, Richard Bowker, with the most streaming cold I've had for ages. So I apologise to everybody. I've got the biggest hoodie I can muster. I've got my Lemsip in my Green Signals mug, and we'll battle on.
Lemsip does even better, Richard, with a little slug of whiskey in it and maybe a drizzle of honey.
Not at this time of the morning. It doesn't when we're recording a show, but anyway.
I don't think it cures anything, but it sure as hell makes you feel a lot better.
Oh, okay, right.
Anyway, another stonking week, which is a good word, stonking, on the viewers and listeners front, with many tuning in for an update on Alstom Derby and the Jacobite steam train debacle. Another good word. We'll come back to that in a moment, as there's, I was going to say a bit of an update, but it's actually quite a lot of an update. But first, a big shout out to not one, but three amazing viewers who gave our last episode some very generous super thanks on YouTube. Richard, if you can't provide a drum roll, I may have to improvise on one of my famous fanfares.
But please don't. I'll see if I can add it later.
You've really got to think about my fanfares, haven't you? So, Roy Tate, Chris Gross, and Robert Davey are real super fans, and we're all really grateful for your generous support. We do really appreciate that, Roy, Chris, and Robert, and to everyone who left so many lovely and extremely humbling comments of praise and encouragement on YouTube. Thanks a lot, and rest assured we'll continue to give this show our very best shot on your behalf. It's made a lot of work, though, hasn't it, Richard? You've been quite busy replying to comments, I think.
It's hundreds now. I think on last week's show it's well over 100 now. But they're great, and there's some really good ones, and they're constructive. Even when people don't agree, they always have a good point of view. So no, keep them coming. Yeah,
it was last time I looked, it was 181. So that's good stuff. Anyway, and one bit of good news is that almost immediately before we recorded this episode, it sort of broke that the government and Alstom are on the verge of doing a deal along the lines that we were promoting so heavily last week. That's right, isn't it, Richard?
Yeah, there was a meeting yesterday between Mark Harper, Secretary of State. Well, I say yesterday. We were recording this on a Wednesday, so it was Tuesday. Between Mark Harper and the CEO of the Alstom Group, the whole Alstom Group, which Mark Harper tweeted about afterwards. And Alstom then said, "This is great. We're now going to be working really hard over the next 6 weeks to pull this together. We're not going to comment anymore until then," which is fair enough. And then actually, Mark Harper wrote a letter to Amanda Soloway MP in which he set out what he discussed with Alstom. And as you say, it was pretty much exactly what Nick Crossfield had talked about on that interview. We talked about 5 trains plus 5, so basically 10 trains for the Elizabeth line. Talked about the Odessia platform coming to Derby. Talked about the supply chain, investing in the plant. It's actually credit where it's due. It's a good letter. So yeah, as you say, exactly what we talked to Nick about does appear to be what's going to be happening.
So a couple of things about that. Maybe we could put that letter on the website in the extra sort of resources bit.
Yep.
So everybody can have a read. And yes, credit where it's due, given his previous letter to Louise Haigh wasn't that good. It was a good letter from Mark Harper. And I'm trying not to say it was green signals what won it. I'm sure that's not the case, but I like to think we played our part in highlighting the issues and moving that one along a bit, maybe.
Yeah. Well, look, every bit helps, doesn't it? And I
Yeah.
think in the end, that sort of pressure. I mean, Nick was brilliant in that interview. If you
He
haven't
was.
watched it, it's still there. You definitely should watch it because he sets it all out really well. And if that's what ends up happening, then yeah, I think we can definitely put a hand up on that one.
Well, I think so, because the way that the arguments came across from Nick, we used the expression it was a no-brainer. And so 4,000 people to date have watched that interview. And it does sort of put pressure on the government by highlighting those very obvious things, 10 trains that we need that'll be cheaper now, blah, blah, blah. It would have made them look a bit silly if they'd done nothing about it. So let's take maybe just a little bit of credit. Let's return to the update on the Jacobite steam train, the railway gift that keeps on giving. We hear that West Coast Railways have actually sorted out some compliant rolling stock and are running services again. I have to stress this is a rapidly evolving story, and so Green Signals is shooting at a fast-moving target. I think I'm right in saying that this last week, West Coast have run Ghost and actual Jacobites, while LSL ran its own West Highlander. And to cap it all, West Coast's real passenger carrying Jacobite failed and had to be rescued by a diesel. So, how has West Coast managed to find compliant stock, Richard? You've been doing a bit of digging with Steph. And what is the current situation?
Well, we'll do our best with this because, as you say, it's fast moving and it's quite complex. Let's just clear a couple of things up, if I can. The first restarted Jacobite did fail. It failed on the approach to Glenfinnan, I believe. I think the engine stalled on possibly on slippy rail conditions. I'm not sure. But the result was it didn't have a diesel on the back providing assistance, so it was kind of on its own. So it did have to be rescued. I think it was dragged back to Fort William. But interestingly, because the diesel didn't have electric train heat, at no point was the heating on during that train. So that would have been a bit unpleasant. And the following ScotRail service, sort of regular service, had to be cancelled, and I think people had to be bussed. So the whole thing was a little bit of a mess. But that's operationally what we believe happened. In terms of lots of people running trains, the Jacobite operator had run, I think, empty coach and stock trains, which they said were for crew training or driver training. Right, but they'd run those in the same slots that they would have run their own Jacobite service. LSL ran their own sort of charter, but I think they ran that in the slot that would sometimes be used by the Royal Scotsman, which is another luxury train that goes down the line.
So it didn't make a mess of single line capacity then?
Don't believe so, no. But it certainly is made for some very interesting sight, and it's suddenly become quite a busy railway line, in terms of people wanting to run up there. So that's kind of all of that. So what's happened in terms of the train itself? Well, all over social media this week, we've had pictures of Jacobite running with, wait for it, Mark 1s in the consist. And that's obviously very unusual because we weren't aware that any of the Mark 1s were CDL fitted and therefore able to operate on the railway. And the consist is quite interesting. It would appear from the images that it goes Mark 2, which is CDL fitted, Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 1, Mark 2. So it's just like, okay, that's a bit strange. So put that to one side for a second. I did a bit of digging into looking at the actual regulations because, actually, don't put it to one side, because the one other thing that appears from the images is that the Mark 1s have stickers on the doors, on the windows, which you can't read, but it does rather suggest that those doors have been locked out of use.
Right. Okay.
Which you could do with a carriage key, okay?
Very simply done.
Very simply done. So the doors would appear to be locked out of use rather than be compliant with CDL. That is relevant when we look at what the rule book says. So what do the regulations say? The Railway Safety Regulations 1999 are really very clear. They say that a train operator is prohibited from operating, and infrastructure managers are prohibited from permitting the operation, so that's Network Rail, of Mark 1 type rolling stock and rolling stock with hinge doors that does not have central locking. So so the regulations start from the position. The answer is no.
Can't run a Mark 1.
Let's talk about the detail. And one of the bits of detail comes in the form of exemptions. So Regulation 6 of these regulations allows the ORR to issue exemptions from various requirements of the regulations. And there is a couple of relevant ones. Regulation 4 relates to the crashworthiness of the vehicle or what its performance in an accident, and the fitting of things like overriders to stop one carriage from sort of climbing over
a post-clapping thing.
Yeah, well, exactly. And West Coast Railways do have a Regulation 4 exemption. If you look on the ORR website, you can see it there. Regulation 5 is the one that deals with doors and central door locking and other parts of the comprehensive risk assessment around the safety of passengers in the vehicle.
Because it's not just about doors, is it?
No, it's about windows and it's about the whole approach to safety. And West Coast Railways do not have a Regulation 5 exemption. And in fact, if you look on the ORR website, it's very clear that that was revoked by ORR in January of 2024 following the failure to win the judicial review. Okay?
Because there's a prohibition certificate there, isn't there?
Well, it's just they had an exemption and it has been revoked. So basically there's a certificate that says that thing that you had before you've no longer got.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
All right. So that's the business. You said, well, how then was a Mark 1 on the railway?
Okay. Even allowed on the network by Network Rail.
Now, this is where it gets into the realms of, postulation or speculation, because we don't know the detail, right?
Well, interpretation, and you do know what you're looking at, Richard.
Well, one thing we've looked at, if you look at Regulation 5, which is the one that deals with these, the doors, it says this. No person shall operate, and no infrastructure controller shall permit the operation of any rolling stock on a railway if the rolling stock has hinged doors for use by passengers for boarding and alighting from the train, other than doors which have a means of centrally locking them in a closed position. Now, they clearly don't have a means of centrally locking them in a closed position because they don't have CDL fitted. So question, is the operator saying, I locked the doors out of use, so they're not doors anymore for the purpose of alighting or boarding a train. So therefore,
regulation doesn't apply.
It's okay. So
in other words, known more widely as a loophole.
Well, I mean, really, I thought the first bit was spot on there. The regulations just don't apply because it's not a door for the use of passengers boarding or alighting. But it is, I'm afraid, a door. All right, you might not be using it as a door, but it's a door. It's not been welded or turned into a body. It's a door. It's just locked. Right? And I think that's very relevant. So I had a look at the BR rule book, and I started with the BR rule book. I mean, partly ironically, because of course a lot of these people want to go back to that. But anyway, I looked at the BR rule book, and it's quite clear. It said that any vehicle with any defective door must not enter service from a maintenance depot. Right? So that's
door singular, let alone all four.
Yeah, or six on a Mark 1, isn't it? Because sometimes
it depends.
It depends what kind of
they don't
coaches.
all have mid carriage doors.
Okay, but under the BR rulebook, if it had a defective door, it don't start the service. Okay, so the question is, does that still apply? And so I then had a look at the RSSB standard on that, which these days is called Preparation and Movement of Trains, Defective or Isolated Vehicles and On-Train Equipment, DOT. And
that effectively took over from the rulebook.
It's the current. It's in the current rule book, but it's just the RSSB version. Yeah, that's a little bit more complicated because it says, and you can form your own view on this, and we'll put the link to this on the website so that people can see it, and then they can form their own view. It says that if you actually find the relevant bit, that door defects on passenger vehicles, section 6. You must not allow a train to start a journey with the body side door that is defective and cannot be used unless the train operator's controller is given authority to do so. And what that means is that individual train operators may have their own specific derogations or risk assessed approaches to this. And a good example of that, perhaps, is on the Greater Anglia units, because they don't have on one side of the train. I think there's a slightly strange door configuration, so they have their own specific regs. Okay. But I wasn't sure about this. I had a chat with somebody who is a very experienced operator, and their view was pretty much the same as mine. Which, if you read that standard, it says you can't start a journey with defective doors, and these are defective doors because they're locked out of use, unless the control approves. And in that regard, it would really need a pre-standing derogation, or I think it's now called a deviation, to have been approved by RSSB. So it's hard to see how all of that got done in basically no time, and that there was a risk assessment and a derogation approved. But I keep coming back to the biggest question of all, Nigel, which is if the vehicles are in service or in a train and with defective doors, one thing's pretty clear: you would not be able to have passengers in them, right? So why have it in the train at all?
Yeah.
Why have three of them in the train at all? That's the bit I don't really understand.
Because all you're doing is converting them into very long corridor connections.
And it seems pointless. Just go and get another vehicle that's got. Why not have 7 Mark IIs with CDL? So look,
and of course, one of them was a buffet anyway, which adds to the complexity.
I believe so. Yeah, there was a beer. If you're into all this stuff, there was a BSK, there was an RMB, which is a sort of the buffet, and there was another vehicle. Yeah. So look, if it were me now, I think I would get. I'd be very surprised if the ORR hadn't gone right. We're going to have a good look at this. We're going to see what they are relying on to justify having a vehicle that ordinarily should not be there. And if it turns out, by the way, that it's in breach of a regulation or whatever, your insurance, as a general principle.
Yes, what a good point.
As a general principle, insurance will say that you are compliant with all appropriate and relevant rules and regulations. Well, if they're not, does that throw into question whether the insurance is valid? There's a long way to go on this.
That applies to your house insurance or your car insurance. There's always a string of conditions, isn't there, whether it's about house locks or named drivers. Okay, putting you on the spot, Richard, from all you've read there, and this would be one of those cases in a court of law where the QC or the barrister said, and I want a yes or no answer. Do you believe that operation is unlawful?
Well, I can't give you a yes or no answer to that, and I don't think anybody can. I think you've got there's facts that have got to be checked. We need to know what the specific risk assessment said. We need to know what derogations are being relied upon. There's all sorts of things. I do come back to the core point, which is Mark 1s without CDL fitted are not permitted on the railway according to the regulations unless an exemption has been given, which in this case it hasn't. And therefore, it must be trying to rely upon an interpretation of something. And I can see an argument where that interpretation is going to fail in terms of whether they should be there or not. I'm not saying it has, but I would, if I were a director of the operator, I wouldn't take any chances on this. So that's we need to see. We need to see what. Oh, look, my view is and always has been: if in doubt, don't. Oh, I think this has got more to give. Of that, I'm fairly certain. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you've summarised that absolutely perfectly. It is very odd, this, and it is a long-standing debate. There's been lots of investment on the line. I mean, crikey, I mean, you live near it, so you know this
I do.
better than me. You know, we've got the Warrington dive under the grade separated junction. We've got all sorts of bits and bobs that have been done to enhance the capacity and improve the reliability. And the plan was, as you say, to have a pretty significant increase in services. I mean, I think LNER had something like a 25% increase in services.
An extra hourly service and...
Yeah, and because they were running an extra hourly service to Newcastle, I think it allowed them to accelerate some of the journey times to Edinburgh. So there was a lot riding on this.
And those headline trains that you just mentioned there are what generated the revenue that the Treasury is now banked.
Well, they announced it, didn't they? As you say, in the budget, there will be a revenue uplift from those more trains. Yeah, there was. I mean, credit where it's due. Superb analysis on this in Modern Railways yet again. I suspect by our good friend Rog.
Captain Deltic at his best again.
Yeah, no, it is when he gets his teeth into something. It's brilliant, and some of the issues that have been highlighted at the 11th hour, pathing conflicts. I mean, pathing conflicts, right? That basically means it does not fit. You can't get all these trains on that timetable, right?
And you can't change the laws of railway physics. If it don't fit, it don't fit.
No, because we've got differential speeds and you know, and all that kind of stuff. Potential industrial action, which is hopefully a temporary thing, but nonetheless it's a thing. There's train crew vacancies at LNER. There's engineering work planned over Christmas. Now, the engineering work planned over Christmas probably just defers the point at which the benefits come on stream. It doesn't. But the pathing conflicts are like really quite serious. There's actually been what's called an event steering group, which is basically a task force. Call it what you like, really.
No, don't call it a task force.
Don't call it a task force. All right. There's been looking at this for about 4 years. And apparently these pathing issues are for freight are really difficult to solve. There's another really interesting thing, which is that during all this time, the ORR has been merrily granting open access paths, which have used up some of the capacity that was expected to be available. But over the same period, the upgrade has actually been changed. So not all the capacity that was going to be available is now available, right?
So we've gone in opposite directions on some crucial aspects. We're running more trains on a railway that hasn't been upgraded as much as it was supposed to do to accept those new trains. I mean, wasn't there a 4-track section supposed to go in at Wood Walton, which is fairly crucial, which never happened?
When you take out those, and I know from my own experience on the West Coast, if you know, things like the Trent Valley 4-tracking were absolutely crucial to capacity and reliability. I thought the letter from Network Rail's Director of Network Performance, Chris Curtis, was really relevant because he said the group overseeing this timetable introduction have concluded there are too many outstanding issues to have confidence that the new East Coast mainline timetable can be delivered robustly in December. You go, okay, right. So it gets deferred yet again. But I think the real issue is not that it's been deferred again. It's what it says about our ability to actually do these things.
Well, May 2018 casts a very long shadow, and rightly so. I thought the comments from Network Rail were really quite interesting, which I suspect will feed into what I think you might be going to say. Network Rail have clearly seized the opportunity to say, in words of one syllable, rail reform is crucial to avoiding similar circumstances as industry fragmentation makes finding a path to a reliable timetable in a timely manner a challenging task. GBR is designed to provide a guiding mind. Do you want to develop your thinking there? Because I have a hunch I know what you're going to say.
Well, yeah, definitely, because I think there's a couple of issues here. I mean, the guiding mind is one that we've talked about before, and whether or not it needs to be a little bit stronger than a guiding mind.
Directing mind is your choice of phrase.
Yeah, and I think we're at that point now. I mean, this is very, very complicated, made a lot more complicated by the fact there are so many moving parts and so many conflicting bits of it. And I have to say also, and I know this is going to sound like a crack record, the DFT with their fingers in the pie sort of, and their approach, their unique approach to risk management means that the industry is not able, I don't think, to kind of sort its kind of own stuff out. I want to touch first, though, if I may, Nigel, on one of my real bugbears, which I think is really relevant in this, which is open access. Okay.
Well, I didn't know you were going to say this. Right.
Well, because if you look at everybody's getting very excited about open access. There was a piece in the press the other day about this is going to be marvelous. It's going to open up new services for millions.
Gives people choice and better fares, and Lumo's taking air business and all that.
Yeah, I've thought about this quite a lot. And I have
flavour of the month all of a sudden.
It is, but I think it's crap. And the reason...
Sorry.
Well...
It's normally me who says something like that.
No, well, I've always...
Just run that one by me again.
Yeah, I think it's crap. I've always believed it, right? This is not a new thing. I've always been slightly against open access. Let me explain why. Back in the good old days, when open access started, it was a free ride. It was a bit of a free ride. They didn't pay open access operators did not pay fixed track access charges. They only paid variable ones.
An all cats raid.
And it was an all cats raid. And for those who aren't aware, I can't even remember what it blooming well stands for now. But basically,
I was just praying you weren't going to ask me then. Just run us through what that means.
Well, it's an acronym for the system that actually divvies up income that's gone from ticketing where
different operators serve the same parts of the railway.
Flow. Exactly right. So
if it's Peterborough Grantham, it get divvied up between the different right. Go on.
Oh, and the other thing, by the way, is open access operators pay nothing towards the enhancement of the network because they weren't a premier. They're paying business. They were only paying variable track access charges. Now, it was up to ORR, of course, whether they allowed these people on the railway. But I think the test was as long as they weren't primarily abstractive, right?
Primarily.
Not abstractive. It was primarily abstractive, right? Now, the world has changed. They do now pay an incremental infrastructure charge, which I think is something like £5 a train mile, or even that has been scaled in. So in the first year, it's 25% and 50% or whatever. So they're paying a bit more than they did. But interestingly, the DFT have changed their stance. So if you remember back to Virgin Trains East Coast, which is when that whole timetable change thing kind of has its genesis, the DFT were dead against open access. I mean, really did side with Virgin Trains in attempting to kind of see it off.
Because of the socking great premium payments.
Well, because of all, I think it was Stephen Hammond at the time made a lot of points about the fact that they weren't paying their fair share, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it just makes the fitting together of an already very complex puzzle really, really difficult. I'm not denying that the stakeholders who have open access services do like them, right? That would be foolish to say that. If you live in Hull, Hull Trains is an important part of the stakeholder map.
It is.
But if you go macro for a minute, these things are a bit of a pain. You tend to be short trains, so they're not optimizing the available slot anyway. They're not paying their way. Even now, they're not paying their way. I know there'll be people listening sort of steaming at the ears now, this. But I would say at the moment, in a railway where there's some serious capacity issues, And it's why I think we come back to the directing mind. I think we're going to have to go, do you know what? On East Coast, you can have this, you can have that, and I'm afraid you lot can clear off. And
by you lot, for the avoidance of doubt.
Well, not everybody can have everything they want, right? That is the real problem, right? And that's why I think we're in directing mind territory.
And of course, stuff like in the search, and we're going to come on to this in a while, I think, a zero carbon railway, we've got DMUs running for 80% of the journey under the wires.
Yeah, well, I think actually, do you know what? Because somebody put us right about that and said the London to Stirling route is kind of wired the whole blooming way.
Yes. But, Hull to Doncaster, and then the primarily abstractive thing, I remember several years ago trying to get Grand Central to give me a breakdown on the business from Sunderland and the business from York, and funnily enough, I could never get an answer.
No. Look, in a world where we had a very low-cost infrastructure and we had loads of capacity, fine. But we have a very high-cost infrastructure and we have very limited capacity. And East Coast Timetable has proved that we're going to have to make some very, very difficult directive decisions.
So in the world of BR 2.0, with you as chairman, the you lot who would be told to clear off would be the open access operators.
Well, no, not just them. I mean, I've
not
got
just
an issue.
them.
Well, no, I think you've got to sit back and go, what do we want this railway to deliver? Right? What we know the East Coast Main Line is good at doing, like the West Coast Main is good at doing, is fast, frequent pulses of trains going to the principal destination points. That's what you need. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be frequent. It needs to be easily understandable, right? That's got to be the starting point for all of this. Yeah.
And that brings in another point, doesn't it? In that the whole, not the whole point, but a key element of the Azuma fleet was that they could accelerate and brake much faster than the more elderly Class 91s and HSTs. So you could accelerate services, particularly with regard to stopping services.
Yeah, and the same thing happens.
And we're not getting any of those benefits.
Well, you're not optimising it. I mean, it's the same thing on the Great Western, which I use. I mean, it's 23 minutes now, sectional running time between Paddington and Reading, I think. 23 minutes. I mean, an HS2's only at Twyford, I think, at that point. So there are real benefits from it, but you've got to take a sort of an overview down. That's why I've been playing Fantasy Railway Manager, right, for the last few weeks, thinking, okay, what would I do?
Well, I mean, interesting. Graham Eccles' name instantly crops up again because Graham, a while ago, I've mentioned this before on the podcast, really made me laugh by saying that, what they should consider doing is getting a dad's army of old stagers like him and Bog Breakwell and Chris Green as a kind of group to swoop in and provide something. And you got to say that that's got some merit to it, I think. There's a lot of elder statesmen with vast experience who know what's required.
There are, and I would absolutely seek wise counsel from them.
Yeah.
But there's also some fantastic managers around today.
There are.
The likes of Alex Hines and Tim Shoveler and Mark Hopwood. We talked about
Chet Kelly, Mark Hopwood. There's quite a few.
All those guys who and the girls that could deliver a lot of this now.
But how much more successful might they be with some high octane support from people who've been there before and can offer some good thinking? It strikes me as is a pretty good idea. In most professions, if you've any sense, you make sense of the wisdom that you've got in.
Agreed.
And the railway just isn't doing that.
So anyway, I've had some fun. I've been thinking about this.
Go on.
Well, I set myself the challenge. All right. Well, what would if I was chairman of British Rail 2.0? I mean, this is real fantasy. Like fantasy.
You're not applying for a job here, are you?
No. I'm just shooting the breeze, right?
Okay.
One of the great things about this podcast is we can kind of say it as we see it, right?
And we do.
And I don't think it's fair to say I would curtail open access and not say what you'd put it in its place, right? So as one example. So I've been thinking about British Rail 2.0 and whether it actually would be a good idea. And I've come up with a 6-point plan.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, I have. Right. And bearing in mind, the starting point of this is that what we need is a safe, boring, predictable, reliable rail. Exactly what we've just been talking about on the East Coast, right? And I think anything that gets in the way of that for the short term has to be sort of stopped. Right? But anyway, so here's my 6-point plan.
This is you as chairman of BR 2.0 now. Okay.
Absolutely. In no particular order, right? I'm not saying one's more important than 6.
I'm agog, as usual.
You're agog. Right. Well, first of all, I'd sort out the ASLEF dispute, right?
Okay.
It doesn't mean rolling over, Mick. What it does mean is engaging with a view to getting it sorted. That's different, okay? 2 is something I wouldn't do. I wouldn't reorganize, restructure. I think there's a kind of with GBR, well, we need to then have a complete restructure. No, don't do that. Certainly not for the first sort of 12 to 18 months. It's massively distracting.
It just stops everything.
Yeah, and I firmly believe this, right, what I'm about to say. You can create the impetus for fundamental change in performance with people around a table with a unified objective, right? Almost doesn't matter what the badge on there. Now, I know there are issues around accountability and safety responsibility. I know that, right? So there has to be some process put in. But that's what Alex has done in Scotland, right? Effectively, right? So that, I think, is crucial. I wouldn't do that. It doesn't last forever. You can't just sort of sit people around a table. You do eventually have to put an organisation in place. Yeah. Otherwise, the whole thing's a bit too kumbaya, you know. But for the beginning, I wouldn't do it. Third, I would create an interim ops organisation. Might be directly operated railways, you know, the thing that Robin Gisby runs, or something else. Because I do think that as the concessions expire, let's bring them into that organisation. I mean, that's going to be the policy anyway.
That's a big statement. Are you aligning with the Labour Party now then?
I'm struggling to see quite what benefit we get in return for the 2% management fee or 1.8% management fee at the moment.
I do hope Louise is listening.
So that's number 3. Number 4, I would create a team in parallel to get cracking on fares, reform and structuring. It's a mess. It's proving a barrier to growth.
Well, there was a plan in place and the DFT scrapped it for the single website thing, wasn't there?
Yeah, and we need to understand that one a bit better at some point because that doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't.
5, I would engage with anybody who's out there prepared to help and support exactly what you just said. The Dad's Army.
The Eccles Fusiliers.
Yeah, and by the way, if you're listening and you're on a day rate and you're thinking fantastic, then that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about people with a passion and a vocation to help put this right. And then finally, I'd consult with all the stakeholders of the industry, and that's not just the people within it, that's the people, you know, affected by it, on the new rail reform bill, or not necessarily that bill, but actually say, right, what do we really need to do? I mean, I thought, again, Roger summed it up quite well. You know, leave the industry alone for 12 months. It's got to sort all this stuff out. Do it no harm, but then talk about what you're putting in place. I mean, one of the things I would do in a revised version of the rail reform bill is I would change the ORR statutory duties when it comes to things like promoting competition and access. Because,
okay.
You know, that the ORR aren't doing the wrong thing with open access. They're discharging their statutory duties. So we've got to have a look at that. That's my 6-point plan. It's very much focused in the first 12 months, 18 months on performance, reliability.
Making it work.
Not getting distracted by reorganisations, thinking long and hard about what you really need, sorting out fares, because I think actually that is such a mess at the moment, and just getting everybody focused on that. So that's my plan.
If you did that before you attempted any sort of reorganisation or structural stuff and all the rest of it, it would also have the impact of allowing the key individuals who we don't yet know as good as they are an opportunity to shine and emerge, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. The one thing I was worried about my otherwise brilliant plan was that in the first, that because we'd not changed the DFT's legal responsibilities, which they would do under the rail reform bill, actually that could put a spanner in the works. I've fundamentally got a lot more relaxed about that because I think with Alex Hines there now, I think that makes that everybody's going to be much more aligned. So that's a good thing.
And indeed, Alex is there now. There was a picture on Twitter yesterday of him and Hugh Merriman shaking hands on his first day. I just hope and pray that they will allow him to do his thing and not force him to go native or neutralise his impact, because Alex can have a major impact.
I agree. He will do. I think him just being there and people being around him will have an impact. But I do think that the entire industry has to realise that the next 12 to 18 months, if they're allowed to do it, is about getting a grip on performance and being ready for the sort of integrated railway in the future, but not making the reorganisation into it the primary focus, because you will get distracted and you'll not do the things you need to do to get confidence back.
It's the CBR strategy, isn't it? The create a boring railway.
Absolutely. There's probably people listening going, well, he's a total idiot. That's fine. But that's fine. That's why
And that will be new how.
All right, fair enough. I walked into that. But that's why everybody's fantasy football team is different, right?
Well, that's
everybody's
right.
got a different plan.
And everybody discusses them with great energy and enthusiasm. So I have to say that when this show is out there, I'm looking forward to the comments. It could be very entertaining.
Yeah.
So who'd have thought it? Okay, listeners and viewers, do you agree with Richard? Do you think he's suddenly rediscovered his inner state-controlled gene, and this is either a plan for getting a grip or a plan to head back to the bad old days? Do let us know. Plenty to talk about, and I'm sure we will. Let's move on, shall we, Richard? Some really positive news. An organisation that is doing, I think, a lot of good these days, and that's RIA, the Rail Industries Association, suppliers group, basically. RIA has launched a new strategy called Delivering a Low-Cost, High-Performing Net Zero Railway by 2050 last week. And Green Signals was represented, as we were all very proud and quite honoured, really, because you were asked to chair the launch event, Richard. And I think even you were quite impressed, weren't you?
I was really impressed, actually, Nigel, because and I said to David Clark on the day, who's the technical director,
a really good bloke,
a really good guy, that what I was really impressed by was the fact that this was the railway industry going, we're not going to wait to be told what to do.
Hooray!
We're going to come up with a plan. Now, he was very sensible. Yeah, it was hooray. And he's very sensible. He said, I'm not expecting this to be the final iteration, right? This is now a starting point, a direction of travel. This is what we think. Now let's work on making this real and detailed and all the rest of it, okay? But he came up with a lovely phrase. He said, there's a lot to be said for physician, heal thyself, and I actually thought, for that reason alone, it was absolutely terrific, and I was impressed.
I'm also minded of Chairman Mao, of all people, with his "even the journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step," and that is true as well, because I mean, I have been saying the same thing for many years. Don't wait. Certainly since the report, that we've not seen put into place. Don't wait for government to tell you. Just get on with it.
No, absolutely. So that's what they did. What was also interesting in this is that the report focused on value for money, which was another kind of really nice surprise, because I wasn't really expecting, sometimes you expect it to focus on, well, let's have more investment, but it actually focused on, well, what actually was value?
Spend it wisely.
Spend it wisely. And it's interesting because the decarbonisation strategy, the transport decarbonisation strategy of 2020, I think proposed electrifying something like 90% of the railway. I was like, it was a lot, right? Whereas this RIA report gets to 66%. You think, okay,
altogether more realistic.
Well, how does that work, right? And the answer are batteries, right? So actually, what they've worked out is that by using battery electric multiple units as part of a sort of what I would call a smart rolling stock strategy, and then thinking about the track train as well. So having fast charging points on the more remote parts of the network. So all really kind of joined up stuff.
Which is being trialled on the Greenford branch by Great Western with
very successfully
with the shooter legacy stock. So we're already doing it. More of it.
And it's all looking great there. They said, if you do that, it's not necessary to put the wires up everywhere. And actually, they sort of describe it as a plan of thirds. So about a third of the network is currently electrified, so 38%. 1/3, they've said they don't really think needs to be electrified. You can use battery electric multiple units.
Yeah.
And the remaining third, which is actually slightly less than that, it's about 28%, does need to still be electrified with overhead wires. But actually, about half of it, 13%, is already in government plans. Now, some of that is Network North, but actually the Network North element's not that.
That all
big.
Sounds absolutely brilliant, because it's been apparent for a while, for the bits of the network that we can't electrify and never would, we need to decide between hydrogen and batteries. And I've always kind of felt, as a non-technical bloke, that batteries sounds the more straightforward way forward. So that's really, really good to hear that RIA have nailed the colours to that mast. It all sounds brilliant, Richard. Where's the catch?
I don't think there's a catch as such. But what RIA have pointed out, there's still a lot of detail to work through. It's a strategy with lots of stuff still to do. There are some issues. Batteries, that's going to be a lot of trains with batteries, and there's actually practical things like, is there enough lithium around to do it? How do you dispose of the batteries? There is the question of, you do need a consistent, steady program of electrification. And one of the other things, there's a very interesting bit of analysis in the report which talks about they do it on what's called a TOTEX basis. So it's not just CapEx, it's not just OpEx, it's TOTEX, so total. Right.
All right.
And to do that, I think Arthur D. Little had done some work for them on this. These battery electric DMUs cost a bit more at the beginning, but after 12 years, the curves kind of cross. And on a whole life cost basis, they're a much better thing to do. That requires the Treasury and the department to go, we're going to spend a bit more up front because we're going to get benefits 12 years beyond.
Good luck with that.
Well, that's where one of the challenges lies. Having said that, I still come back to the same point. I think they're immensely. I think they should be immensely applauded for having done it. And now,
well done, Ray.
It is down to the industry now to kind of go right. And when I say industry, I don't just mean this. This one genuinely involves the DFT and the Treasury and stakeholders who had been pre-briefed, so they knew what was coming. Everybody now needs to come together and go, okay, it's a good starting point. How do we take this to the next step?
We're in the strange position now of me slipping into your normal role and saying, but the government, the Treasury, the DFT are not known for looking long-term on railways at any point in the last 20 years. I said it was role reversal, but especially now. And that's just, what's the end of that comment? Well, that's about it, really. There's an uphill task to face to bring them round. And I think RIA are to be applauded for being brave enough to take that first step and come out with all this stuff, because too often the railway says, well, if we say that, the DFT and the Treasury will say no, so there's no point in saying it. So well done, RIA. Keep it going. And I hope that, Darren Kaplan, the chief exec, and David continue to push really hard for this. Because it makes eminent sense. If we've got to the point where we've decided hydrogen isn't the answer for the non-electrified bit and batteries are, then just let's JFDI and move it forward.
But there is a truism. I agree with that, right? There is a truism there, which is that, and I'm not sure this might even be a Roger Fordism as well. I can't remember, but it's very true. An electric railway is a better railway, however you define that. Right, there is no downside to electrifying your railway.
No, in terms of there's a bit more in original cost, I think, but they're much better.
But they're lighter, they're faster, the lower operating cost. The trains themselves have got lower cost per mile of the fuel. I mean, even if you don't quite subscribe to the whole decarbonisation thing by 2050, an electric railway is still a better railway.
And that is a really good note to just put a full stop on that section, I think, with us both being optimistic, despite a bit of role reversal towards the end.
Might need to lie down.
In a darkened room. Right, shall we do the quiz?
Oh, yeah, the quiz.
With your brain-tangling question from last week, which has caused much pearl-clutching throughout the kingdom.
Well, there's been a few good attempts. I mean, just to remind you what the question was. The question was, what links the following 4 towns? Richmond, Yorkshire, Thrapston, Bideford, and Colville. And there was some wags out there, you know, like, is this restoring your railways? Latest set of proposals, which I thought was quite funny, since Richmond is, of course, Rishi Sunak's constituency. The idea of him having a new railway there, I thought was quite amusing. What he would say. No, it's nothing to do with restoring your railways. Actually, it is a complicated one, and I accept it's a complicated one. There are 296 district councils.
I hope you're all paying attention out there.
In Britain. Yep, there are 296 of them. And here's some interesting fun facts. Of the 296, I said Great Britain, didn't I? English, right? English districts. There are actually 8 that have no national railway stations, but actually 4 of them have national rail lines running through them, but no stations. And those 4 districts are Torridge, East Northamptonshire, Northwest Leicestershire, and Richmondshire. Those are the 4 English districts that have national railways running through them, but no stations. And the district council offices for those 4 districts are located in Thrapston, Richmond, Colville, and Bideford. So
that's real Times crossword style.
It was a bit, wasn't it?
Thinking, I have to say, I'm impressed. I was totally bloody baffled when you said it up front, and I'd have never got there. A few people were straight in, but they don't have stations, but you can still buy tickets to them on the.
Yeah, that was a popular one, wasn't it? No,
yeah,
that's the answer.
But,
yeah, so those are the 4. There are 8 that don't have any national rail stations. There are 2 of the 8 which have rail stations, but no national rail stations. That's Rosendale and West Somerset. You can work that one out because those are heritage lines.
Okay.
And there are 2 district councils that have no rail presence at all, neither stations nor lines. And they are Gosport and East Dorset. There you go. Shall I do this week's question? It's a lot easier.
It'd be good to know who the winner is.
There isn't one.
Really?
Me. No one else got it.
And you've got a mug.
And I've got a mug. Right. So yeah.
No winner.
No winner.
Didn't realise that.
No winner.
You've beaten them.
Yeah. So this one, there will be a winner. So this one is a little bit more about speed. And here's the question. And it's a 2-parter. I will only accept the correct answer if it contains all the parts. Okay.
Here we go.
What is, or where was, the highest railway viaduct in Britain? And how high was it? And where is currently the highest railway viaduct in Britain? And how high is it? So
That's a really good one.
4 parts, yeah.
I'll give them 20 minutes before it's popping up on YouTube, but we'll...
I thought that was quite a good one. It's a bit easier than last week's. Yeah.
Good game, as Brucey used to say. I do like that. So there you have it, peoples out there. Get figuring out your viaducts. Right. Shall we do our good positive news bit?
I think you should.
Because this one has really tickled my fancy, I have to say. Northern Rail has been trialling using... It's just priceless, is this? Northern Rail has been trialling using classical music to deter antisocial behaviour at its stations. And believe it or not, it's been so successful that the operator is making it a permanent fixture. The trial began at 9 stations in 2022, playing music inspired by Beethoven, Mozart and Handel. And it was then rolled out to another 26 stations last year, aimed at preventing loitering, vandalism and graffiti. Customers say they felt safer at the stations because large antisocial groups had stopped gathering. And now Northern is looking to expand to more stations. I'd never have thought that. It put some mischievous questions in my mind, Richard. Maybe maybe our viewers and listeners could come up with some answers. Are there specific circumstances in which specific pieces of music would become appropriate? For example, after a period of disruption and you've got stations crammed with people, maybe the Hallelujah Chorus. Or I don't know, the William Tell Overture. There's all sorts of really. So over to you. If you've got any suggestions for particular music for particular occasions on the railway, we'd like to hear them. But look, you're our very own resident top class musician, Richard. What do you think of it?
I think it's great. There's a lot of I think there's a lot of evidence that shows it does calm and it is stimulates that sort of relaxation gene or response, if you like. I believe it also classical music can improve your memory, right? I don't know. Anyway,
is that right?
I think you've got to pick your piece. So I'm not sure that sort of dramatic piece from the one that played at the start of The Apprentice, which I think is Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, isn't it? It's the March of the Capulets or whatever. That wouldn't really stimulate too much calm, and I wouldn't play the Dies Irae from Verdi's Requiem either, because that's but there's some fabulous pieces that I think really would work. So I think it's a brilliant idea.
It is. In fact, as soon as we finish recording this podcast, I'm going to go and root out my best classical albums ever and stick them on in the hope that I can remember what I'm doing for the rest of the day.
Oh, I think it happens over an extended period. Right? I believe so. Okay. Yes.
Well, I'll give it a bit of a. I'll give it a bit. Classical music, sort of stuff. I guess, like many people, and I know this really annoys classical music fans. All the greatest hits and bits that are popular that you like, but I wish I knew more about it. Bit like wine, I suppose. It's something I wish I knew more about. Maybe I ought to spend a bit more time finding out about it. Well, enough of this, because that's all we've got time for this week. As usual, thanks ever so much for watching or listening. We really do love having your company. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, or subscribe on whatever channel you can, in whatever way you can. And most importantly, do join us again next week. And I really can't close without a big thanks to Steph, who did a load of research for us this week. We get the privilege of sitting here talking about it, don't we, Rich? And she's done a whole load of work in the background that makes that possible. The more simple the comments we make, the more research goes into it. So it's goodbye from me, and
it's goodbye from me.
Thanks for being with us. See you next week.